So hi everyone, my name's Navin. For those of you who don't know me, yeah, I was a debater here a few years ago. Um, I use she, her, they pronouns. I'm excited to be giving this seminar, and the topic will be CP strategy. Yeah, which I think is very relevant for some of the upcoming tournaments, hopefully. The first thing I wanted to start off by talking about, which is why CP I think is a really great format. I know that some people aren't as into it, but I think the popularity is actually increasing these days, which is nice to hear. I think CP is a really excellent format. I feel like I learned a lot about debating in CP. So I will give you some reasons as to why I think you should get involved in CP instead of just being a BP debater. The first is that I think there's actually a really interesting strategic, there are very interesting strategies that only apply to CP. Obviously, BP has its own strategies, but I think like the 2v2 or like 1v1 in terms of team format is very unique. And it means that your refutation is different. It means that your motion picking is different. It means like how you prep for specific teams is different. Like all of that is a really like fun game, I think. And I think it makes the sport of debate very interesting. Um, it also teaches you, I think, a lot of really great fundamentals. Like prepping a good case on Gov is genuinely a challenge. And I think having to do that is very developmental. Similarly on op, I think I've learned a lot about opping through CP because you really have to like get down to the basics and think about very key assumptions about emotion. I think that I learned kind of a framework for opping through CP that helped me in BP. So, like I've been saying, I think it's great prep for a BP season. And I honestly think I might like the refutation in CP better than BP because even though sometimes it can be shallow, I think it is also often nice and direct, which is really nice. So, the rest of the seminar will be some tips on each of the teams and how I think you can be an effective CP debater. So, oh, and feel free, I guess, to like jump in at any point if you have questions, and then we can also talk about questions at the end if you want. For motion writing on Gov, there's a lot of obvious stuff that hopefully you've heard of as well. If I remember correctly, Sarah wanted me to make this like slightly advanced, so I won't go over like the most introductory things for motion writing. But yeah, obviously you want to prep well in advance. Having more time is honestly a very key part of it. And a lot of the reasons that govs lose is because they just didn't spend enough time prepping. You can target people, and it's great to think about who's attending a tournament and who you like run each motion against or what motion you'd run against each team. And then obviously playing your strengths, like you should think about what you're good at debating, topics that you really care about and like, and focus on those. I will say that you probably shouldn't pick something that you have a ton of spec on. I've seen teams also kind of like spiral out if they know too much, similar to in a BP round. Know that like op won't know as much as you and is also really like winging their op. So if you think that an uninformed op would throw off your gov, you probably shouldn't run that motion. Um, I really like creative motions. I know there's a very common thing where people like to use like old motions from old tournaments, and that's great if you find like a niche motion that you feel like you can really do well. But especially a lot of the motions that we've all debated in some form or another typically aren't the best in CP, because one of the major advantages you have on Gov is to be able to play to your strengths and to be able to have like a very unique case format that people won't necessarily be expecting. So I think that is a very important part of the strategy. Um, I also think that having any kind of like hidden trap door or silver bullet case is a bad idea. A lot of people design their cases such that like ops will agree to a motion, maybe not even tight call it, and then they like bring up this like secret argument that no one had thought of. I think that usually kind of breaks the format in an annoying way, and ops will often complain. And I think one of the easiest things to do, even though it's a shorter format, is for CP to get incredibly messy. And it's harder for you to rise above that mess in CP than it would be in BP. So it's important that you run a very clean case and not one that is like supposed to be tricky. Yeah, I think also one thing that I noticed when I debated CP last year, I think is that a lot of people seem to confuse what is framing on Gov and what is the actual case that you write. You obviously have fiat power in terms of a case that you write. Like if you want to write a scenario or whatever, you're allowed to fiat whatever you want in that case. But be clear about what is the case and what is framing, because a lot of the time op will call you out for some kind of unfair framing that they were able to contest. I'll talk about that more on op 2, because I think it's really one of the most common pitfalls past like novice mistakes in CP. I also think op choice is a great strategic call for the same reason. Tight calls are one of the easiest ways for CP debates to get messy. And I think that being able to just run it op choice avoids a lot of that. That's something Eric and I learned at the tournament we went to last year. We got a bunch of tight calls, and then for the rest of the tournament, we just ran op choice and it went a lot better. Finally, I think you should bait op where you can. That isn't using trapdoor arguments, obviously, but I do think that there are ways in which you can get op to pick certain sides or do certain things that are perfectly legitimate arguments, but they haven't thought about what specifically would win in a debate context. So I know that's a bit of a difficult point to illustrate, so I thought of 2 examples. The first is a pretty common CP motion. Maybe some of you have heard of it, like the soccer Super League motion. I'm not sure who originally wrote it, but essentially it's about like, should we create like a super league in soccer where like very, very successful teams all only fight each other and don't fight like the worst teams? I don't know the details because I've never run this. But essentially it's supposed to bait the op into picking like the anti-super league side. But when you really think about what would win in a debate context and what arguments you can make, it's actually far easier to win on the pro super league side. I guess that was like a hard illustration to make very quickly. So if you want clarifications on that, let me know. But essentially, yeah, like I think you can think about what specifically wins in a debate context. Similarly, one of my favorite cases is my vegan dogs case. Essentially, it's like if you fiat out health impacts on the dog, would you feed your dog vegan? And again, if you run it op choice, most people think obviously you should feed your dog vegan if you personally are a vegan, which we set the house to be. But I think there are actually a lot of arguments on op that people initially discount. So essentially the point I'm trying to make here is like, if you are op, think through genuinely what you think will work in a debate context, not just what's objectively true in the real world. And similarly on Gov, if you can like devise a motion that baits op into thinking one side is the winning side when it isn't, it's a great move for you. On engagement for Gov, I think the Prime Minister needs to be quite thorough and preemptive. A lot of the time, one of the biggest issues with Gov, obviously, is that they lose in the big 10-minute stretch that op has after the DPM. Because of that, both speakers should try and be as preemptive as possible, because oftentimes you won't have a ton of time to respond afterwards. You need to really be thinking about what kind of engagement will happen throughout. And the great thing is you have infinite time to prep your case, so you really can be very preemptive and think through exactly what you imagine the op to be. The DPM should almost be entirely engagement. I think in BP, a lot of people like to introduce constructive in the DPM, and I think that's relatively valid. In CP, I think less so. Like maybe you could argue that you should still have you can still have constructive in the DPM, but I pretty much never did. And I think that especially because you can prep a very concise PM, you usually don't need to. You also definitely should not be flippant. This is again a very common mistake I feel like I see in CP is like DPMs think they can shrug off a lot of analysis, but remember, even if an LO didn't like build ref particularly well, they have 10 minutes to do it after. So you really need thorough refutation as opposed to just like shrugging off a lot of the case lines that they introduce in the LO. Obviously your PMR is incredibly important. So one of the things I struggle with in BP is that sometimes I wonder if whips are like kind of useless. They're obviously not. I was a whip speaker, but like a lot of the time judges have like largely made up their minds up to a whip speech, and you're really working against preset notions that they have. That's to an extent true in CP, but I think less so. And I've seen replies flip a call far more often in CP than I've seen whips meaningfully change a ranking, even though obviously both do. So I think 6-4, ideally, you should use in most situations. I think there are situations where you can do 7-3, but usually you should go with 6-4, I think, just because the reply is so important and responding to the 10 minutes of op content is a pretty critical part of your strategy. You definitely should learn how to prioritize things, especially if you know a lot about the topic, especially if you've prepped a lot. Like, people get very distracted by a lot of the shit thrown against the fan by opposition. Opposition will likely take that strategy where they just have a bunch of different ideas that they throw out. Think about what specifically wins the debate and focus on that, both in the PMR and in the DPM, because in both cases you have limited time to engage with op content. So think very carefully about what wins the debate and just ignore things from op that won't affect the actual call. And then obviously prepare to defend a tight call. Again, I honestly kind of hate tight calls. I know they're obviously an important part of how CP works, but they always mess up the round. So be prepared to deal with it in a very succinct and logical way, and then move on so that it hopefully doesn't mess up the round too much. Okay, I'll move on to op for now. So op case prep, a few more pointers. So in terms of tight calls, again, like I just said, I'm not a huge fan of them and I use them quite sparingly on op. I know other people might use them more generously, and there's maybe an argument to the fact that you can try one. I think at least when I was finishing up being very involved in the circuit, there was a meta moving towards really expecting quite a justification for a tight call. You can't just say the word tight and hope that it works. You have to really justify why you believe the motion is tight. I think that's a good direction for the community to be moving in, and I hope it still is. So I think yeah, if you can truly justify a logical and systematic reason why a motion is tight, sure, run your tight call, run it specifically as an argument, not just as a word that you throw out at the beginning of your speech. But also be very cognizant of the differences between framing and a case. So one example to use here was actually at Leger. A motion was run against us that was, "This House regrets English as the predominant language in African education." I don't think this motion in and of itself is tight. None of the words of the motion make the motion tight, but the Gov framed it as in education systems across Africa, people deride their native languages and say that English is the only legitimate language. And we were that's stupid framing. Obviously we can't defend a world where that's the case. And so it's about you being able to recognize what is emotion and what is framing. And then when it is framing, you're perfectly welcome to question that framing as much as you want. So I think ops are often very liberal with tight calls because they want essentially to critique the framing of Gov, but you're always welcome to critique framing just like you would in BP. You just have to frame it like framing as opposed to the actual motion that's been written. Yeah, op, again, I think it's a very common strategy to throw shit at the fan. I think that's fine. You definitely should be broad, but don't try and avoid being messy. I think being able to go up on LO and say we have these arguments and these will be developed throughout the round is very important, and it allows you to avoid callouts of a DLO dump, which I get to a little later, I guess, as well. Again, I think you should try and be creative. I think one of the reasons I truly love CP is it really encourages creativity. A lot of the time in BP, especially in the current meta, which I feel I've talked about a lot, is people really run very standard arguments and have to run them with just meticulous intensity. But I think in CP, you're rewarded more for having very out of the box ideas rather than just the basic arguments that you've prepped to death. So I think particularly on op, being able to throw a curveball at Gov is really nice. So really try and question basic assumptions rather than just think I guess I should run this because that's what most people would run. Yeah, LO should definitely prioritize getting key arguments out. You shouldn't really try and worry about style. Obviously, you should probably never really try and worry about style all that much. But I think, yeah, in general, particularly for LO, you should be really focused on getting even just titles of arguments out. You can often really claim that you brought something up early and that DPM was flippant, as long as you flag it in the LO, and then the DLO can flag what the LO said. Essentially, all of this is trying to avoid the criticism of a DLO dump. If it looks like you have too much brand new engagement in the DLO, you can get called out for it in the PMR and get pretty significantly hurt. It also is just occurring to me that I'm using like a lot of acronyms very quickly. Please let me know if people aren't just like familiar with all of this, but hopefully we're all familiar with these terms because they're just the speaker positions in CP. If a topic is a weakness for you, obviously that's part of the game, and I think a lot of people will target you based on specific things. So, for example, a lot of sports motions were run against me. A lot of like econ motions were run against me because those weren't my strengths. But I think, and this applies to BP too, and this is advice that's really helps me in all formats of debate, is like just return to the key principles. Like every single motion in the world is just about people at the end of the day, and if you can think about who are the people affected, like how they will respond, and what the implications are for like the values we hold in society, whatever, like that will guide you in literally any debate. So don't get too bogged down in details if you don't know them. Judges often aren't convinced by details. Remember that oftentimes Gov will like write a motion that they're an expert in, but the judge isn't necessarily, unless they're also being strategic, but that's another story. I think like in general, just think about what makes sense and you can often do quite well. And then in terms of speaking, I think you should split. I guess there's a school of thought out there that is very powerfully in favor of the 10-minute power speak. I think for pretty obvious reasons, in the most situations you should split. Having 7 minutes to prep a reply probably means your reply is better. And so I think splitting is quite nice. But yeah, I guess do with that what you will. Finally, on engagement for op, I think a lot of ops end up just being mitigatory, which again is bad. I think you should try and be creative and be very substantive in your engagement. So don't just kind of like critique little details in the gov, because I think that can be annoying and often pretty easily defended. Be very mindful of a PMR, because similarly, like I was talking about before, like replies often flip a call in CP, and so you really should not be flippant or like mocking in your 10 minutes. Like I think a lot of ops will refute a little and then almost go on like a little like victory lap for the remainder of their 10 minutes because they think they've already won. It happens more often than you'd think, where like if you feel like you're winning the debate by like minute 4 of your DLO, a lot of people will just like kind of stop trying, and the LO reply will often also be quite lazy. That's quite a dangerous game because yeah, PMRs often flip the round, and so be very mindful of what you're arguing and always imagine what the defense would likely be when you're saying something, because PMRs can be quite powerful in this format. The 10 minutes is typically where you will win, though, typically because the LO doesn't have a ton of time to prep a very strategic case. They just need to get things out there. Obviously, if you have a great LO, lovely, you can win from the LO, but especially if the round is close, the 10 minutes is your key time. So use that time benefit to your advantage, right? Like, you can particularly target the DPM. Like it's a great opportunity for you to say like, hey, we brought this up in the LO, but like the DPM was flippant with it, and now we won't get a chance to respond to whatever the PM says in the reply. So you can also use the positioning of the speeches to your advantage. That's a really important thing about CP in general, is like, but again, because it's a 1v1 format for the teams, it's so like directed at each other, and you can specifically talk about the structural advantages and disadvantages that each team has. Obviously, you can talk about the ability to respond to something in BP as well, but I think it's particularly important in a lot of CP rounds. Finally, just know that most govs have not prepped as much as they should have. Hopefully you were not that gov, but usually govs have not used the fact that they have infinite prep time as much as they should have, and so they're usually winging it. If it's op choice, try and guess a side that they're worse at if you're struggling to pick a side. And in general, just know like they probably haven't thought through every single line of refutation you've thought of. And you probably shouldn't be overwhelmed by anyone who seems like they're an expert in the topic, because usually people have prepped it like day of. Hopefully you aren't those people, but you can use that to your advantage. I think that's all that I have. So if anyone has any questions about CP, I'm happy to talk about them. Otherwise, thanks so much. Do I call on people, or should I like let some? I'll call on people. Harvey?
Hello, I had a question. So I know you briefly mentioned op choice and how you would deal with that, like as someone on the op side. But like, would you recommend running op choice as like gov?
Yeah, I'd say in most situations I would, as long as you have time to prep both sides. Obviously, being realistic, I know a lot of people won't have a lot of time prepping, and so if you want to just prep one side, that's fine. I think it's particularly important if you are at all worried about a tight call. Like, if you can imagine a tight call being made on your motion, even if you think it's unlikely, I really like op choice for that reason. If you don't think it's possible at all, like maybe you're running like a Woodic motion or something that you know is balanced, like then it's probably less important. But yeah, I would say op choice is mainly to avoid a tight call. I hope that helped. Emily?
Hi. Um, yeah. I what do you do in rounds where you're like fighting for a long time over the like tight call and neither side can really resolve like whether it is a tight call or not? Because like I feel like sometimes in like debates, like there's like the debate that's happening, and then there's also like a meta debate that's happening over like whether or not we should even be debating what we are debating. So like any advice on what to do when that happens?
Yeah, that's a good question. I agree. I feel like that's a very common issue in CP and I hate it. I think the two pieces of advice I might give, um, the first is I think like as long as you have couched your like tight call if you're the op or your defense of the tight call if you're the gov in true like logical analysis of the motion, um, you have to just hope that stands and hope the judge sides with you. Um, and the second thing is again like delineating framing from emotion. And I think using particular terminology can be clarifying for a judge. So if you say like, oh, the gov motion is perfectly fine, but they just cannot possibly frame it that way. Otherwise, it's obviously tight. But we have the ability to question their framing. So we're going to do that on op. Like if you get very clear about your meta debate and use very clear terminology, hopefully that helps. But the kind of overarching advice that I would give is to not spend too much time on that, even if it continues to be a fight. Like, honestly, like pretty much any gov will defend against a tight call. And so it will end up being a bit of a back and forth. And I think that sucks a lot of teams in. Um, Try not to do that. Like, you really should not spend more than like maximum a minute, I think, in your speech discussing meta debates. Ideally less than that, because I think judges hate it and it makes the format really messy. So try to just run away from it, even if you don't feel you've necessarily won the tight call. Like if it doesn't seem like it's going anywhere, just run away is what I would say. So hopefully that helps. Serena?
Hello, thank you for the talk. I have very little exposure to CP, and so I was wondering if you could, like, off the top of your head, give an example of how to make a tight call argument, like literally what that sounds like, because I've never heard it before, or if you could suggest like a YouTube video round that you think is a good example of this.
Yeah, that's a good question. The only thing because I honestly have made like so few tight calls in my career because I really hate making them. Um, I think one of the like quasi tight calls I made, and again, I don't even know if this qualifies as a tight call because there was more questioning framing, was that like English round. And so I guess it was Eric who made the tight call. So maybe he can speak to the details of this better. But like essentially we were just like this framing systematically means that we have to defend racism, and that's stupid. Like obviously this motion can stand without us having to defend racism. But I think essentially like the logic of a tight call should show a logical path between the constraints that they put op into and an indefensible stance. So as long as you can say like, the fact that they make us defend specifically this means we have to defend X thing that goes against core values in debate, such as like not being racist or like respecting people's autonomy or whatever. Like, or I guess like autonomy is like, anyways, there's like more to it, obviously, but I think in general, as long as you can tie it to something that you think is indefensible, that's a good strategy. In terms of YouTube videos, I truly do not have a good example. I'm not like I'm not one of the debaters that has a good like YouTube catalog in my head, but I'm sure other pros do. You can ask like Eric or Chris, because both of them have better YouTube libraries than I do. Yeah, RP.
Hello. So in the two CP tournaments I've been to, I've run the 10-minute speech every single time. And I just wanted to ask then, I guess like I'm gonna give my reason for why I think it's good, and I just wanted to know your thoughts on it because maybe I'm missing something. So the reason why I really like the 10-minute is one, it feels really sexy. But more importantly, is because I feel that judges credit the last 3 minutes of a 10-minute speech more than they would credit the LOR. Like, I feel like maybe this is just because I don't have much CP experience and I come from more of a world schools experience where often the reply speeches aren't really credited as much and they're not supposed to swing the debate. I think this was also the case with CP in high school when I did it. So I feel like I worry that judges might like not credit LORs that much because like it's just the reply speech. But if it's part of the DLO, technically they're not supposed to credit it as much or have all the new stuff there, but like they don't really pay as much attention because like, oh, it's just a really long DLO speech.
Yeah, that's an interesting argument. I definitely can see the merit in it. And yeah, like I will definitely admit like there are some very good CP debaters out there that are proponents of the 10 minutes. So I definitely wouldn't want it to seem like I'm stating like a fact that the split is better, but I do still think the split is better just because while I agree replies often are very difficult to sway, particularly the LO reply, because it's kind of an extension of a speech they just listened to. I think the extra prep time and actually the like cognitive change in person for the judge allows them to take a more like framing approach to the reply than it would be like an extension. Like I think for the same reasons that you were talking about, where like they see a power speak as one speech, whereas they see a reply as two. Like I think that can be to your advantage in a lot of CP rounds if you wanted to get into meta debate or you want to be summative. Like I think there are a lot of situations where you might want the judge to think it's a new speech and want to be able to point out strategic issues. I find that like, and this also might speak to like my style as a second speaker, but like I would often be very like line by line in my engagement, and I wouldn't necessarily be super thematic, and I wouldn't have time to think thematically before my DLO. And then whoever my partner was would be able to come up and summarize what I said because they were able to like take notes while I like ad-lib stuff, and then also summarize what they said in a way that's far more meta. And is able to like point out strategic issues with Gov, because again, I think meta ends up being more relevant. But yeah, I don't think there's an objective answer for sure. So if you like power speaking, go ahead. Yeah, Emily.
Sorry, I couldn't figure out how to raise my hand as the host. But I'm just like, so when you go to CP tournaments, sometimes there are just like motions and cases that like don't work in CP that generally work as cases in BP. So like as a general rule, what topics do you find are like easier to win on or like are things that you should stay away from when designing your motions?
That's an interesting question. I honestly like I fully believe you, but I don't know if I've ever run into a motion that I like distinctly thought like, oh dang, like this belongs in VP. Like there are definitely, I think there are like motions that have a lot of depth that maybe you don't have a lot of time to get into in CP. And like maybe an op could be unhappy that they had to prep in that time. But like I think in general, like BP motions are built to be functional for front half to win. So I don't know if I have run into that issue. Like, do you have an example of a motion that you felt was like specifically suited to BP?
I think it's more like sometimes you'll run a motion on CP and you'll realize that like it's like the topic area itself is like too difficult to flesh out in like a front half speech, and so you get into like really confusing details. Like someone once told me in my first year that like if you get into a really murky this house regrets motion on CP, it's very difficult to like get to all the depth of it, especially when it's like dealing with like a historical case study and then you're trying to get into all the details of it, so like that kind of thing.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting take. I just feel like for me, and again, I very easily could be missing something. I just feel like if it's a motion that doesn't suit itself well to even like a front half wrapping their head around it, like it might not be a good BP motion either. Like I wonder if like, because I think any BP motion should be approachable, definitely for a CP Gov, because you have infinite time and the same speaking time. And like arguably for an op as well, because they're supposed to be able to think of something. Admittedly, yeah, like you're right. Like I think like normative motions definitely can be difficult in CP just because they're very complex. And sometimes like front halves act differently when they know there is a threat of a back half. And so they're often more deep in BP than they are in CP just because they know they have to be. So that might have been something that that person was getting at. Because yeah, it does obviously change front half dynamics too. But yeah, I don't think I have a good answer to that. Sorry.
No, that's helpful. So like generally just like things that are good BP motions are relatively safe for CP.
I'd say as a general rule, yeah. That's my take at least. Harvey?
I had another question. This is just like pure curiosity, but the vegan dog motion, like what kind of arguments would you run for that?
For like which side or both sides?
The side that says you shouldn't feed your dog vegan, like if you keep health reasons aside.
Okay, yeah, it's I honestly love this motion so much, but Chris like hates how much I bring it up because I've had it for many years. Eric honestly ran the PM, so I feel like I'm not going to do a great job of summarizing these arguments. You can ask him if you want more details. But essentially, we thought like if you are an ethical vegan, broadly, if you like deconstruct the principles, specifically like the motion fiats that you are ethical, like you're an ethical vegan, you're not necessarily doing it for like climate change or anything. Broadly, your principle is about like non-maleficence towards animals. And the case specifically fiats before Op makes a choice that your dog doesn't like vegan food as much, like it's very dissatisfied, even though the food brings it all the nourishment it needs and it doesn't suffer any like health consequences from it. And so the argument on the side for feeding your dog meat is like, if you believe in animal non-interference, like like you probably shouldn't like have a pet at all, maybe, but like in the context where you do have a pet and therefore essentially have like an animal that you believe you shouldn't be interfering with, like you shouldn't create more dissatisfaction for the dog. And you can likely buy like very ethical products. I think we had other arguments as well, but yeah, like essentially it gets to like our argument was like ethical veganism is not necessarily only about just that no animal should die, but that it's more about non-interference and non-maleficence with regards to the natural world and to animal choice. But yeah, it's a weird notion. I will admit that. So yeah.
All right. I'm super sorry if I have to stop the seminar here. I might sound like the worst person in the world at the moment, but stopping Navin from her seminar. But everyone, please clap for Navin. I'm so glad that she's here. Like I've never heard a seminar from Navin before, and this is actually my first time hearing it. So